In the autumn of 1698, in the public squares of Moscow, a man close to 7 feet tall moved among the scaffolds. He was the Tsar of Russia, and he had come home in a fury. Months before, he had been in the shipyards of the West, a monarch pretending to be a common carpenter, learning with his own enormous hands how the modern world built its fleets and its power. Then word had reached him that the musketeers of his own guard, the same corps that had drenched his childhood in blood, had risen in revolt. He abandoned his tour and rode east, and when he arrived, he did not order justice so much as vengeance. Through that autumn, by the estimate of contemporaries, some 1,200 men were put to death, and their bodies were left in the squares through the winter as a warning that no one in Russia could fail to read. This is the man the world remembers as Peter the Great, the Carpenter Tsar, the visionary, the giant who seized a backward country by the collar and dragged it into the modern age. The legend is not false. He built an empire, a navy, and a capital out of almost nothing, and he made Russia a power that would shape the world for 200 years. But the legend has learned to look away from the scaffolds. It looks away from the marshes where a shining city rose over the bodies of the poor, from the church he chained to his throne, from the sun he would one day destroy in a fortress cell. This is the story of both men at once, the reformer and the terror, because they were never two men. They were one. He did not civilize Russia gently, he did it with the knout. To understand the giant, you must begin with the child and with a staircase. Peter was born in Moscow on the 9th of June, 1672, the son of Tsar Alexei and his second wife, Natalia Narishkina. He came into a world already divided against itself. His father had ruled long and married twice, and the two marriages had left two families circling the throne, like rival dynasties, the Miloslavskis, kin of the first wife, and the Narishkins, kin of the second. When Tsar Alexei died in 1676, that old quarrel became the central fact of Russian politics, and it would very nearly cost the boy his life before he was 10 years old. The Russia into which he was born was a world unto itself, and it was old. It was a realm of immense distances and few roads, of ice-bound winters and wooden towns, ruled from the Kremlin by a Tsar who was less a king than a sacred image, hedged about with ceremony, bowed to like an icon, hidden behind a wall of ritual and beard and brocade. Its calendar counted the years not from the birth of Christ, but from the supposed creation of the world. Its learning was the Church's learning. Its face was turned inward and backward toward Byzantium and the certainties of the grandfathers, and away from the quick, strange, dangerous nations of the West. It was a world that had changed very little in centuries. The child born that June would spend his life breaking it apart. For a few years, the danger only smouldered. Peter's sickly elder half-brother Fyodor took the throne, and the Narishkins waited in the long shadow of the Miloslavsky court. But Fyodor died in the spring of 1682 with no child to follow him, and Russia was left to choose between two boys. There was Ivan, of the Miloslavsky blood, some 15 years old, half-blind, slow of speech, and forever ill. And there was Peter, of the Narishkins, only 9, but quick and healthy, and already unnervingly tall for his age. The patriarch and a gathering of boyars looked at the two, and passed over the elder, and proclaimed the younger boy Tsar. To the Miloslavskis it was a disaster, and at their center stood a woman of real gifts and real ambition. Sophia was Peter's half-sister and Ivan's full sister, a princess in a country that kept its royal women shut away, and she had no intention of vanishing into a convent while her family was pushed from power. She found the weapon that lay ready to hand in Moscow. she found the Streltsy. The Streltsy were the musketeers of the Tsars, the standing garrison of the capital, thousands of armed men, proud and privileged, and by 1682 deep in grievances over withheld pay and brutal commanders. They were the most dangerous crowd in Russia, and Sophia's allies knew exactly what to whisper into their ranks. A rumor ran through the barracks that the Narishkins had murdered the boy Ivan in order to seize his throne. It was a lie, but it was a lie with an army behind it. On a spring day, the Streltsy came into the Kremlin under arms, drums beating, and the world of the 9-year-old Tsar ended. To quiet the mob, the royal family was brought out onto the great red staircase of the palace, and the boy was made to stand there in the open before a sea of upturned, furious faces. His mother even had Ivan carried out beside him, alive and unharmed, so that the men might see the rumor for the falsehood it was. For a moment it seemed it might be enough. It was not. Someone gave the crowd a name, and the killing began at the foot of the stairs in full view of the child. The first to die was Ataman Matveev, the old statesman who had been the great protector of the Narishkins. By the accounts that survive, the Streltsy tore him from the very top of the staircase and flung him down onto the raised pikes below. Over the next 3 days, the mob hunted through the palace and the city for the men on its list. It dragged them into the courtyards and cut them down, councillors and commanders, and, at the last, Peter's own uncle, Ivan Narishkin, given up to the crowd only after they threatened to butcher everyone in the palace unless he was surrendered. Much of it happened where the boy could see. He watched men who had carried him and taught him and guarded him killed in his own home, while the crowd roared and his mother wept, and neither the church, nor God, nor any soldier in Moscow lifted a hand to stop it. When the Streltsy had at last spent their fury, they dictated the terms of the peace. Both boys would reign, Ivan as senior Tsar, Peter as junior, seated together on a strange double throne, with a hidden compartment behind it from which the adults could murmur the children's lines. And the true power would belong to neither of them. It would belong to Sophia, who now became regent of all Russia, ruling in the name of the brother she protected and the half-brother she had every reason to fear. She had what she wanted. And the boy on the red staircase had something too, though it would take him years to learn how to use it, a wound that would never close and a hatred with a name. For the rest of his life, Peter's face and body were subject to violent convulsions. A tic that would seize his features, a jerking of the head, sudden fits that unsettled everyone who saw them. Later, writers have often traced those convulsions back to that week on the staircase, to a terror that no child of 9 could hold inside him. It cannot be proven, and it should not be spoken as fact. But this much is beyond dispute. The man never forgot the Streltsy, and he never, to the end of his days, forgave them. Sophia sent the inconvenient boy and his mother away from the Kremlin, out to the royal village of Preobrazhenskoe, beyond the edge of Moscow, out of sight, out of mind, a spare Tsar kept quietly in reserve should the sickly Ivan die. It was meant to neutralize him. It did precisely the opposite. Freed from the suffocating ceremony of the court, Peter ran wild in the best possible sense. He shot upward at a startling rate toward the height of close to 6 feet 8 inches that would one day let him look down upon every crowned head in Europe, and he poured his enormous restless energy into the one thing that consumed him: soldiers. He gathered the stable hands and the falconers' sons and the idle young men of the district into companies of play soldiers, and he drilled them and armed them, not with wooden toys but with real muskets and real powder and real cannon, until the games began to draw real blood and the play regiments began very quietly to turn into something that was no longer play. Down on the rivers and the lakes, he discovered something stranger still. Sailing. An old English boat, found rotting in a storehouse and able to tack against the wind in a way no Russian craft could manage, seized his imagination entirely. In later years he would call it the grandfather of the Russian Navy. He found his way, too, into the foreigners' quarter of Moscow, with its taverns and its engineers and its soldiers from a dozen nations, and there he began to learn the wider world that his own court had walled itself against, and to gather around him the first of the low-born, brilliant, foreign, and disreputable men who would one day help him remake a kingdom. A boy who had been handed a village in which to be forgotten was quietly teaching himself to command armies and to love the sea. Out in Moscow, Sophia looked toward the village in the meadows and saw a harmless eccentric playing at war, a boy who would never trouble anyone. It was the single most dangerous misjudgment of her life. He was 9 years old, and he had watched men with long guns and axes turn a throne room into a killing floor while the crowd roared, and no one, not his mother, not the church, not God, lifted a hand to stop it. For 7 years he would be all but exiled to a village of meadows and stables, a spare Tsar kept in reserve, while his half-sister ruled in Moscow, and forgot him. Everyone forgot him. Out in the fields, the boy was drilling stable hands and falconers into little regiments armed with real powder, learning the one lesson the Red Staircase had taught him, that power belonged to the man with the loyal soldiers, and that he would never again stand unarmed before the guns. He was learning to wait. The waiting was not idleness. In the royal village of Preobrazhenskoe, beyond the northern edge of Moscow, the boy whom Sophia had sent away to be forgotten was quietly building the instrument of her undoing, and he was building it in the open so plainly that no one in the Kremlin thought to be afraid. The years of the regency were meant to be a slow erasure, a spare Tsar left to grow harmless in a field of stables. They became the opposite. Freed from the stifling, incense-heavy ceremony of the Kremlin, Peter grew with a ferocity that seemed to animate his whole frame. He was a creature of constant motion. He could not sit still, could not be silent, could not be content with the rote devotions of a royal captive, and he poured that restlessness into the one pursuit that consumed him, soldiers. What had begun as a boy's diversion, the play regiments he called the poteshny, hardened by slow degrees into a rigorous school of war. He dressed his companions in the coats of the West, drilled them in the manual of the modern European infantry, and marched them through the muddy lanes of Preobrazhenskoe with a discipline that shamed the old city garrison. He razed earthwork forts and stormed them. He took a common soldier's place in the ranks himself, serving at the drum and then at the gun, learning war from the bottom rather than commanding it from the top, as his birth allowed. These companies took their names from the villages that housed them, Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky. And out of a child's game there grew the first 2 regiments of the Russian Guards, a force that owed its loyalty not to the Streltsy or the old Boyar clans, but to Peter alone. On the water he discovered a stranger passion still. In a storehouse he came upon an old English sailing boat, derelict and half-rotted, that could do the one thing no Russian rivercraft could manage, beat against the wind, and it seized his imagination entirely. In later years he would call it the grandfather of the Russian Navy. He carried that obsession to the broad lakes north of the city, to the deep water at Pereslavl, and there he built and sailed a little flotilla of his own, teaching himself the trades of the shipwright and the pilot on an inland lake in a country that as yet could not reach the open sea at all. What had begun with a single salvaged hull grew into a small fleet of his own building, drilled and maneuvered on fresh water in a landlocked realm. A rehearsal, though no one yet understood it as one, for the saltwater navies he would float within a decade. He was drawn too with an almost gravitational pull to the German quarter, the Nemetskaya Sloboda, the walled suburb where Moscow penned its foreigners. It was a fragment of the West set down at the edge of the Muscovite capital, Dutch merchants and German technicians, Scottish and Swiss officers, weary adventurers from a dozen nations, their houses and taverns and workshops offering the only window into a world that felt awake. There Peter shed the heavy robes of a sacred sovereign and asked the questions the Kremlin had never allowed. Not how a rite was performed, but how a thing was made, how a clock kept its time, how a bastion was laid out, how a hull took the wind. And there he found the two men who would become his great early tutors. One was Franz Lefort, a Swiss-born soldier of fortune, worldly and extravagant, who threw open the doors of Europe to him. The other was Patrick Gordon, a grizzled Scottish general who had spent a lifetime in the Tsar's service and understood, better than any Russian, how the gulf between old Muscovy and a modern army might be closed. Among the crowd that gathered around the young Tsar was a sharp, quick-witted youth named Menshikov. He was said to have begun life hawking meat pies in the streets of Moscow. The story is old and unprovable, and in the end it hardly matters, for the truth it points to is real enough. He came from nothing. He had no birth, no lands, no name that Russia knew. What he had was cunning, a bottomless energy, and a boldness that delighted Peter. And on that alone he began a climb that would carry him in time to the rank of serene prince, field marshal, and first governor of a capital not yet founded. The pie-seller's boy would end among the richest men in Europe. His rise was the living proof of the new order Peter was already beginning to imagine, a world in which use mattered more than blood, and the Tsar's favor could raise a beggar to stand beside kings. While Peter drilled his regiments and haunted the foreign quarter, the regency of Sophia began to fray. Her government had staked its standing on the strength of Russian arms, and Russian arms had failed her. Twice her favorite, Prince Golitsyn, led great hosts south against the Crimean Tatars, in 1687 and again in 1689. And twice the armies struggled across the burning steppe and came back with nothing to show but heat, sickness, and exhaustion. The campaigns were meant to crown her rule with glory. Instead, they hollowed it out, and the nobility began to glance from the failing regent toward the strange, towering young man in the meadows who was quietly assembling an army of his own. In early 1689, at his mother's urging, Peter was married to Eudoxia Lopukina, a girl of a pious, old-fashioned boyar family. The match was meant to announce that the junior Tsar had reached his manhood and no longer needed a sister to rule in his name. It was a union of policy, not affection, and it settled nothing. It only sharpened the question now hanging over Moscow. Which of them, the regent or the grown Tsar, would rule the other? The rupture came in the short summer nights of August 1689. Word reached Preobrazhenskoy in the darkness that the Streltsy were arming, that Sophia had loosed them to finish what had begun 7 years before on the Red Staircase. Whatever the truth behind the rumor, the terror it struck was real, and it was the terror of 1682 come again. Roused from his bed, Peter did not stay to reason or to test the report. He fled, bolting into the night half-dressed, riding hard for the one place in Russia whose walls he trusted, the great fortified Trinity St. Sergius Monastery, some 40 miles north of the capital. He reached it at dawn, exhausted and badly shaken, The wound had reopened, and for a night he was again the boy on the stairs, hunted and unarmed. But this time the ending was different. To the monastery in the days that followed came the officers of his guard, and then the patriarch, and then the nobles, and at last the Streltsy colonels themselves, reading the change in the wind and abandoning the region to save their own necks. Sophia's support did not so much collapse as evaporate. She was left with no army, no allies, and no argument, and in the end she was taken and shut behind the walls of the Novodevichi convent, at the edge of the city she had ruled. She had reached for the throne through the Streltsy, and the Streltsy had failed her, as one day they would destroy the man who now took her place. Peter was 17 and master of Russia, though for years he wore the mastery lightly. He still shared the double throne with his half-brother Ivan, a gentle, half-blind, perpetually ailing man who asked nothing of power and lived out his days in prayer, and much of the daily labor of government Peter left, contentedly, to his mother Natalia, while he returned to his regiments and his ships. Only when Natalia died in 1694 did the full weight of the state settle onto him in earnest, and when Ivan too died, early in 1696, the last shadow beside the throne was gone, and Peter stood alone at the head of the largest country on earth. He was not yet 24, and already he was looking past its borders. At 17 he had won a throne without firing a shot, and he found he did not want to sit still on it. The boy who had built toy armies now had a real one, and a country that sprawled across a third of the known world, and yet could not put a single warship on an open sea. He would go looking for that sea, south first, to the Turkish guns at a fortress called Azov. And when Azov had taught him exactly how far behind the rest of the world his kingdom had fallen, he would do a thing no Russian Tsar had ever done. He would leave Russia altogether and go west, and learn to build the ships with his own hands. The first blow fell against the walls of Azov. In the summer of 1695, reaching at last for open water, Peter led his new regiment south against the Ottoman fortress that guarded the mouth of the Don and the road to the Black Sea. He expected to take it quickly. He found instead a long, humiliating stalemate. His army could invest the fortress by land, but it could not close the river, and so the Turks resupplied and reinforced the garrison by water whenever they pleased, and the siege wore itself out through the heat and dust of the season. Twice his men were flung at the walls, and twice they were thrown back. By autumn, the Russians drew off, beaten less by Ottoman arms than by their own want of a fleet. The failure taught him more than a victory could have. It showed him, in the plainest terms, that the old Russia could not force the door to the sea, and that command of the water was the hinge on which the whole thing turned. He did not brood. He went to the forests near Voronezh, on a river that fed the Don, and through a single brutal winter he conjured a fleet out of the frozen wilderness, driving thousands of peasants, soldiers, and hired foreign shipwrights to fell timber, forge iron, and lay down galleys and gun barges in the snow, at a cost in labour and lives that the state kept no account of. Peter was everywhere in the work, an axe in his own hands among the shipwrights, driving the yards by his labour as much as by his command. By the spring of 1696 the new flotilla dropped down the Don and sealed the river, and this time, cut off from resupply, Azov fell. That same year his half-brother Ivan died, leaving Peter the sole and undisputed master of Russia. He had his fortress, and he had his lesson. The modern world was built and defended on salt water, and a Russia that could not sail was a Russia that could not survive. He did not wait for the dust of Azov to settle. Almost at once he conceived a thing without precedent in the history of the Russian throne, the Grand Embassy, a diplomatic mission of some 250 men, that would roll west across Europe to seek allies against the Turk, to hire the experts of the West, and to see with the Tsar's own eyes how the powerful nations made themselves powerful. It set out in the spring of 1697, led in name by his old mentor, Franz Lefort, and travelling within it, entered on the rolls among the junior men as a sergeant named Peter Mikhailov, went the Tsar himself. It was a fiction that deceived no one. A sergeant close to 6 feet 8 inches tall, whose face worked with a restless tic, and whose eyes devoured every detail in a room, cannot be hidden in a crowd. The courts of Europe knew perfectly well who the towering Carpenter was, and played along with the disguise because it suited them to treat with a monarch shorn of the ceremony that would otherwise have slowed every exchange to a crawl. The incognito freed him to work, and work was what he had come to do. He studied gunnery at Königsberg along the way, taking instruction in artillery and earning a certificate for it before the embassy pressed on into the heart of the Dutch Republic, the maritime workshop of the world. At Zaandam, the little shipbuilding town north of Amsterdam, he lodged in a cramped wooden cottage and hired himself out at a private yard as a common workman. But he was recognized within days, mobbed by the curious, and driven on to Amsterdam, where the vast wharves of the Dutch East India Company gave him the room and the cover to labour in earnest. There, for months, the Sergeant Tsar worked with his own hands on the building of a ship from the keel upward, sweating beside the carpenters, mastering the joinery of a hull and the mathematics that lay beneath it. He could not be held to a single trade. Between shifts he went to the anatomists and watched them open the dead. He learned to draw a tooth and to handle a surgeon's lancet, skills he would inflict on his own courtiers for the rest of his life. He studied etching and engraving, toured the paper mills and the workshops and the cabinets of curiosities, and gathered it all up with the hunger of a man trying to carry a whole civilization home in his baggage. No detail was too small for him, and no labour beneath him. The Tsar of all the Russias blistered his hands in a foreign yard, because he meant to be the one man in his own kingdom who understood, from the inside, the thing he was about to command it to build. In the first months of 1698, the embassy crossed the sea to England, at the invitation of King William III, who wished the Tsar to see the finest fleet in the world. Peter stayed some 4 months and worked at the Royal Dockyard at Deptford on the Thames to master the one thing the Dutch had not given him, the English science of designing a ship on paper by rule and proportion before ever a timber was cut. The Dutch yards had made him a craftsman who could build by eye and by hand. The English yards would make him something rarer, a designer who grasped why a ship of given lines behaved as it did, and among the king's shipwrights he bent himself to that harder, colder science. He lodged nearby at Sailly's Court, the elegant house of the diarist and gardener, John Evelyn. And there the collision of the Tsar's household with English refinement passed into legend. The Russians wrecked the place. They fouled the fine rooms, splintered the furniture, and ruined Evelyn's cherished garden, at one point trundling one another in a wheelbarrow straight through his prized holly hedge for sport. The Crown afterward paid the bill for the damage. It was a small, absurd, meticulously documented scandal, and it caught the whole strange visit in miniature, of vast and heedless energy loose in the careful house of the West, taking what it wanted and leaving the fittings in pieces behind it. The errand first used to justify the whole enterprise, a grand alliance against the Turk, quietly came to little. Europe had wars of its own brewing and no appetite for Peter's. But the embassy's true harvest had never been the treaties. It was the education of the Tsar himself who came away from the Amsterdam yards, having built a ship from the keel up with his own hands, and carrying the craft of the West in his head, and it was the men. Everywhere he went, he recruited, for he had come not merely to admire the West, but to strip it for parts. He signed on hundreds of specialists, shipwrights and cannon founders, navigators and engineers, surgeons and mathematicians and officers, luring them with pay and rank to follow him back to a country most of them knew only as a rumor of cold and distance. Man by man and skill by skill, he was assembling the human machinery of the new Russia he meant to build, and he was assembling it in the very yards and workshops of the nations his own had always feared. He had seen in a year and a half abroad what a country could become when it bent knowledge and industry and the sea to a single will, and he had resolved to force that same shape onto Russia, whether Russia consented to it or not. The wonder and the coldness were already bound together in him. The same eye that marvelled at a Dutch dry dock or an English draftsman's board measured, without sentiment, exactly how much of the old country would have to be broken to make room for the new. He was deep in these schemes, weighing even a journey onward to Venice to study the building of galleys, when the world he had left behind reached out and seized him. The letters that overtook him spoke of a rising in Moscow. It was not a matter of policy or protocol. It was the ghost of his childhood come back in arms, the one enemy in the world that could reach past the reformer and touch the frightened boy on the staircase. For 18 months, the tallest carpenter in Europe had gone where no Russian Tsar had ever set foot, and had taken from it exactly what he came for: the plans, the men, the science, the hard certainty that his country could be built anew in the Western image. Then a letter reached him on the road home. The Streltsy had risen again in Moscow, the same corps whose muskets and axes had drenched his childhood in blood. He did not finish his tour. He turned his horses east and rode hard for home, and every skill of building he had gathered in the West would now be turned first to a work of destruction. The letter had reached him in Vienna, and it turned him for home like a blade turning in an old wound. The Streltsy had risen, 4 regiments of them posted to the distant frontier, and sick of it, unpaid, ill-used, kept far from their families and their trades in Moscow, had mutinied and marched back toward the capital, meaning to force their grievances on the government, and some of them to bring the Regent Sophia out of her convent and back to power. But by the time Peter recrossed the Russian border, the rising was already over. His loyal commanders, the old Scot Patrick Gordon and the General Sheen, had met the mutineers near the Resurrection Monastery, the New Jerusalem, west of Moscow, and broken them there with disciplined volleys and massed artillery before they ever came in sight of the Kremlin. A hurried inquiry had followed, and a number of the ringleaders had already been hanged. To almost any other ruler the affair would have been closed. To Peter, it was an opening, the chance to finish, at last, the war that had begun beneath his feet on the Red Staircase 16 years before. He came home late in the summer of 1698 in no mood for mercy, and he judged the first investigation a whitewash. He did not want the mutiny merely punished. He wanted it open to the root, to prove what he had already decided, that the Streltsy had never been anything but a weapon, and that the hand behind them was his sister's. Through the autumn, the interrogation chambers at Preobrazhensk worked without pause. Hundreds of men were put to the question under torture, again and again, to wring from them the confession the Tsar had already written in his mind. Much of what they said was said only to stop the pain, and proved nothing against Sophia that a fair court would have accepted, but the machinery did not stop. The investigation would grind on in one form or another for years, and by its end the corps that had terrified 3 Tsars was to be struck from the army of Russia altogether. Then came the executions, and they asked to be named plainly and weighed, and then left, not looked away from, and not dwelt upon. The plain facts are these. Between the autumn of 1698 and the following year, roughly 1,200 of the Streltsy were put to death. The count most often cited is some 1,180, and around 600 more were knouted, branded, and driven into exile, many of them the youngest of the corps. The killing was not hidden. It was carried out in the open, in Red Square, and at sites across Moscow, deliberately, as public spectacle, so that no subject of the Tsar could fail to grasp what had been done or why. The condemned were brought out in carts to the scaffolds, and afterward the bodies were left on display through the winter, unburied in the frozen squares, a warning that hung over the city until the thaw. These were not enemies in the abstract. They were the musketeers of Moscow, men with wives and children and trades, a proud and privileged caste that had guarded the Kremlin for generations. And in the span of a few months, that caste was deliberately destroyed. It was terror used as an instrument of rule, the calculated manufacture of dread, and Peter meant every hour of it to be seen. This is the scene that a great painter, Vasily Surikov, would set on canvas nearly 2 centuries afterward in his Morning of the Streltsy execution, the grey Moscow dawn, the crowded carts, the guttering candles in the condemned men's hands, the wives and mothers massed in the square. It is a towering picture, and it has fixed the morning in the world's eye ever since. But it must be held for exactly what it is, a reconstruction, imagined and composed long after the fact, and not the record of any man who stood in that square. For what an eyewitness actually saw, we depend on a handful of foreigners, and the fullest of them was a hostile one. The principal foreign account of those months came from Johann Korb, secretary to the Austrian embassy in Moscow, whose diary is the most detailed outside record of the executions and also, unmistakably, the work of a man who regarded the Tsar as a barbarian and made no secret of it. Korb wrote that Peter compelled his own boyars to serve as executioners, forcing the axe into the hands of his courtiers so that the old nobility would be bound to the killing and made to share in it. And Korb, with 1 or 2 others, reported that the Tsar did not merely preside, but took up the axe himself. This last is the darkest charge ever laid against Peter, and it cannot be proved. It rests on the word of foreign observers who were hostile witnesses to a scene they found monstrous. No Russian record confirms it. It was reported and repeated, but never established. It has to be carried exactly that way, as something contemporaries claimed, not something we know. What is certain is grave enough without it. That the returning Tsar reopened the affair, drove the interrogations, ordered the executions by the 100, and made of them a lesson written across his own capital. With the core destroyed, its patron was finished too. Sophia, who had reached for power through the Streltsy in 1682, and who was charged now with reaching for them again, was forced to take monastic vows behind the walls of the Novodevichi convent, her name struck from public life, the reckoning that had waited 16 years complete at last. And in the same season, Peter put away his past in a second, quieter way. Eudoxia Lopukina, the wife of his youth who belonged wholly to the devout old Muscovite world he had come to despise, was sent to a convent at Suzdal and shut away, her marriage dissolved by nothing more than the Tsar's will. One after another the fixtures of his childhood were being struck down. The guard that had terrorized it, the sister who had wielded that guard, the wife who belonged body and soul to the world both came from, as though the returning Tsar meant to leave nothing of the old Moscow standing that could ever again hold power over him. The reckoning with the Streltsy was only the first blow. Within days of his return, at a reception held to welcome him home, Peter did a thing that struck his courtiers as hard, in its way, as anything in the squares. He produced a great pair of shears, and with his own hands cut the beards from the highest boyars of his court. To the men of old Russia, the beard was no ornament, but a sacred inheritance, worn at the bidding of the church, the mark of an orthodox man made in the image of God. To lose it was a kind of maiming. Peter knew this, and cut them anyway. In time, the beard would not merely be cut, but taxed. A man made to buy the right to keep his own face, and to carry a small bronze token as the proof that the levy had been paid. It was reform imposed as force, not persuasion. The old Russia not argued out of its beard, but shorn of it under the sovereign's own blade. And it was the opening move in a longer campaign to strip the outward Russian away and remake him in the likeness of the West. That was the shape of everything that would follow. It was not a gentle awakening of the Russian mind to the reason of Europe. It was amputation, carried out by decree and knout and fear. And the two truths of it cannot be pulled apart. The same season that broke a mutinous garrison and shaved a frightened nobility also set Russia, past all turning back, on the road to becoming a modern power. The transformation was real, and it would outlast him by centuries. So was the terror that carried it. Men have counted the dead of that winter and argued its meaning ever since, and the account has never once come out simple. The man who wielded both was the same man in the same hour, and he was never the one without the other. When the snows came, the bodies still hung in the squares of Moscow, and the corps that had terrified 3 Tsars had ceased to exist. Peter had answered the wound of his childhood in full, and the answer had been terror. Now he turned the shaven, frightened country outward, toward the one thing it had always lacked. Far to the north lay the Baltic and its ice-free harbours, and between Russia and that sea stood the Empire of Sweden, ruled by a boy of 18 whom all of Europe took for a fool. On a snowfield outside a town called Narva, Peter was about to learn exactly how wrong that judgment was. The dream of the sea had been the boy's obsession since he found the rotting English boat in a Moscow shed, but the reality of the sea was held behind a wall of Swedish steel. For a century the Tsars had looked toward the Baltic and seen only a closed door, its ports and its provinces held fast by the Northern Empire of Sweden. In the spring of 1700, having at last bought a fragile peace with the Ottoman Turk, Peter turned his whole restless attention to the north. He bound himself into a coalition with Denmark and with Saxony Poland, and marched to besiege the Swedish town of Narva on the Baltic. 3 powers wagering that the young empire, newly passed to a boy king barely come of age, would crack under the weight of a war on every side. The prize they meant to divide among themselves was the Swedish Baltic itself, the ports and coastlands that had walled Russia away from the sea for 100 years. It was a calculation of cold necessity, and it rested on a single catastrophic misreading of the enemy they had chosen. The Swedish king was Charles XII, and if the courts of Europe took him for a lightweight, it was a failure of vision that history would punish. Charles was 18, austere, devout, and possessed of a single-minded martial ferocity that would soon make him the most dangerous man in the north. Before Peter could so much as drag his cumbersome siege train up to the walls of Narva, Charles had already struck. With a speed that stunned the Allies, the young Swede landed his forces near Copenhagen and knocked Denmark clean out of the war within weeks, forcing the Peace of Travendal before the coalition was even fully in the field. Then, unhurried, he ferried his veteran army across the Baltic and turned north to relieve the beleaguered garrison at Narva. By late November 1700, The Russian army lay before the fortress, dug in behind a long, sprawling line of earthworks and trenches. Peter's forces were numerically far the stronger, perhaps 3 or 4 times the size of the Swedish column now marching toward them through the winter murk, a relief army of only some 8,000 to 10,000 men. But numbers were not the measure of them. They were an army still half-made, badly supplied, divided in their command, stiff with outdated drill, their ranks thick with raw conscripts, and their senior posts held by hired foreign officers. Peter himself had ridden out of the camp only a day or 2 before the Swedes appeared, gone to hurry up reinforcements and to manage the wreckage of his collapsing coalition. He left the siege in the hands of his foreign general, believing the lines secure. He could not have judged it more wrongly. On a bitter morning, late in November, the weather itself turned against Russia. A violent snowstorm swept across the plain, a blinding, swirling wall of white that erased the world into a grey blank. Charles did not wait for it to clear, nor for the comfort of good daylight. He saw the chance hidden in the chaos, and he took it, driving his men forward in 2 dense columns straight into the heart of the Russian works, the snow at their backs and full in the faces of the defenders. The Swedes came on with a disciplined, rhythmic intensity the shivering Russian conscripts had never faced. When the attack tore through the earthworks, the Russian line did not bend, it broke. The panic was total. Whole regiments threw down their arms or fled in a blind rush toward the river Narva at their backs. A pontoon bridge gave way under the crush of the retreating mass, and the water became a graveyard. The foreign officers, distrusted by their own men and unwilling to be torn apart by them, surrendered in a body. By the time the early dark came down on that frozen afternoon, the Russian army had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The tallies of the killed, the wounded, and the drowned differ from account to account, but they run to something near 8,000 or 9,000 men. The whole artillery train, the heavy guns Peter had laboured for months to haul through the mud, was lost, together with the war chest and the captured generals. Narva became, across every chancery in Europe, a byword for the backwardness of Russia, the standing proof that the sprawling eastern country, for all its numbers, could be broken in a single winter afternoon by a disciplined few. The news of the disaster reached Peter, and it did not break him. The defeat was so complete, so emphatic, that it seemed to confirm every prejudice the West had ever held, that Russia was a vast, ungainly relic that could never be forged into a modern state. Had Charles pressed his advantage that winter, driving straight on into a defenceless heartland, the reign might have ended in the snows of 1700. But the Swedish king reasoned by his own narrow, iron logic. He judged the Russian bear beaten and caged, a secondary problem safely shelved, and he turned instead toward the south and the Polish-Saxon king, certain the war would be settled in the fields of the Commonwealth. It was the single decision that would in time cost him everything, for it handed Peter the one thing he could not have seized by force: years. Charles would spend those years deep in Poland and Saxony, winning battle after battle that settled nothing, while behind him in the east, the enemy he had written off rebuilt everything that had been lost. Back in his own country, the Tsar did not despair, and did not retreat into the certainties of the old world. He set in motion instead a total, ruthless remaking of the Russian state and the Russian army on the plain, understanding that his host had failed because it was a collection of ill-fitting parts, and that he must forge those parts into a single, lethal instrument or lose everything. He looked at the vast idle wealth of the church and did not hesitate. By his decree, the great bronze bells were taken down from the cathedrals and monasteries, hauled to the foundries, and recast into the barrels of new cannon to replace the guns lost at Narva. A sacrilege in the eyes of the pious, a simple necessity in the eyes of the architect. He drove new levies into the ranks by the tens of thousands, raised and drilled whole new regiments through the seasons that followed, brought in foreign masters to teach and to train, and spent his own days in the yards and his nights over the drafting table, pushing his enormous frame past the point of exhaustion to keep pace with the thing he was building. An army that had been destroyed in an afternoon was conjured a second time out of a country that had just lost its first. The remaking was not swift, but it was relentless, and within 2 years it began to tell. The army that had shattered at Narva came back drilled, gun-heavy and sure of itself, and it went looking for the forts it had once had no answer to. In 1702 it returned to the Baltic and struck at the chain of Swedish strongholds that guarded the mouth of the Neva. Peter took Göteborg that autumn, an island fortress at the head of the river, and renamed it Schlüsselburg, the key city, for it was the key to the sea he had wanted his whole life. In the spring of 1703 his forces pushed down to the river's mouth and stormed the last Swedish outpost, Nenskans, and as the smoke thinned, Peter stood on the raw bank of the Neva and looked out along it toward the cold grey water of the gulf beyond. He had reached the sea at last. Narva, the worst humiliation of his life, had become in the end the forge of the army that now took these forts. The Tsar had picked the lesson up out of the snow and beaten it into iron. The war was nowhere near won, and he was still a Tsar without a secure harbour. But he had proved that his army could learn and fight and win, and he had found at the ragged edge of the empire the ground he had been looking for. Narva had shown the whole of Europe a Russia that could be broken in a single afternoon, and Charles rode away south, certain that the Tsar was finished for good. It was the greatest mistake of his life. While the young Swede spent his genius chasing a Polish king through the mud, Peter melted the bells of his churches into cannon and built his shattered army again from nothing. And at the cold, flooded mouth of the Neva, on a scatter of marsh islands not yet dry enough to stand on, he looked at the grey Baltic water he had bled for and decided to build there, not a fort, not a harbour, a capital. At the mouth of the Neva, where the river loses itself in the grey expanse of the Gulf of Finland, there was almost nothing worth the taking. A small Swedish fort, a scatter of fishing huts, and a wilderness of reed and tidewater that no ruler had ever thought worth governing. The Swedes themselves had largely left it alone, and for reasons any surveyor could have recited. It was a country of mud and flood, a low delta of shifting islands that drowned beneath the Baltic whenever the autumn gales drove the sea back up the river. Fog lay over it for weeks together. There was no stone in it and no ground high or dry enough to trust a foundation to. It was a place where no careful man would raise a barn, let alone the capital of an empire. But Peter had not come to weigh the site by the rules of prudence. He had spent his whole life reaching for open water, and here at last the mouth of the river was his, wrested that season from the Swedish enemy. In May of 1703, on a scatter of marsh islands scarcely dry enough to stand on, he began to build, not a fort, and not a harbour, but a capital. For Peter, the very impossibility of the site was the point. Russia sprawled across a third of the known world, and yet had never been able to set a ship of its own upon an open, ice-free sea, and the grey Baltic water at the Neva's mouth was the door he had fought his whole life to reach, the long-desired window to the west. He had bled for this ground and taken it at last from the Swede, and he would not let mere geography stand between him and the harbour he had won. If the sea demanded a capital where no capital should stand, then a capital would be made to stand there, whatever the earth beneath it said, and whatever it cost the men who built it. On the little island the Russians called Zayachi, Hare Island, he laid the foundations of a fortress and dedicated it to the Apostle Peter, and from that first hard point in a sea of mud, the whole settlement took its name. St. Petersburg, a name that chimed with the Tsar's own, but was given, he insisted, for the apostle and not for himself, a heavenly patron rather than an earthly one. The distinction meant little to the men sent to raise it. To anchor walls in ground that behaved like water, the builders drove uncounted thousands of wooden piles deep into the sodden peat, and upon that submerged forest the ramparts slowly rose. There was no quarry within reach, and no road to bring stone if there had been. Every block for the fortress and, in time, for the Tsar's long straight avenues had to be floated in by barge from hundreds of miles off, or hauled north in the small forced quotas that Peter soon demanded of every cart and every vessel that came near the place. The fortress came first because the war was not over, and the Swedes might yet come back down the Gulf to reclaim what they had lost. Only under its guns could the rest be built at all. The host that raised the city was no citizenry, but a conscription. Year upon year, tens of thousands of peasants were levied from every corner of the empire and marched north under guard to the marshes, and to them were joined labour regiments, gangs of Russian convicts, and Swedish soldiers taken prisoner in the war. They came under guard, and they worked under guard, and they were sheltered almost not at all, quartered in earth dugouts and beneath sailcloth, moving the ground of the delta with their hands, with sacks and barrows, and with the very skirts of their coats, standing to the knee in cold and stagnant water. What the work cost them in lives no one ever truly set down, and no one ever truly could. Disease bred in the standing water. Hunger and exposure finished what disease began. The burying of the dead became one more labour of the living. The levies came up in rotation, village by village and province by province, so that the burden was spread across the whole face of Russia. But for the men marched north, there was often no rotation home, and a great many who went down into the marshes never came out of them. The figures that later ages have fixed to that dying vary so widely that they confess their own uncertainty. A toll of some 30,000 is often repeated for the early years, while estimates across the whole reign have run from around 20,000 up toward 100,000, the records far too poor and too partial to settle the truth between them. The city built on bones was and remains a phrase and not a count. What cannot be doubted is the fact beneath it that St. Petersburg was raised at a price in human life its own government never troubled to number, and that the beauty gathering on the Narva stood upon its own dead. Peter did not merely found a city, he commanded a nation to come and live in it. He decreed that the great families of Russia, the boyars whose forefathers had dwelt for generations in the timber and whitewashed stone of Moscow, must quit their ancestral houses and remove north to the raw edge of the empire at their own crippling expense, and there build in stone to the strict geometric plans laid down by the Tsar and by the architects he trusted, foremost among them the Swiss-born Domenico Trezzini. A noble who would not build might lose his lands, a merchant who failed to come might lose his goods. Every ship and every wagon that entered the city was required to carry its measure of building stone and surrender it at the gates, a levy that turned the whole northern traffic into a supply train for one man's design. The ministries were transplanted, the foreign embassies were made to follow, and around 1712 the working heart of the empire was lifted out of the ancient snarl of Moscow and set down, by will alone, on the flooded rim of the Baltic. The men so uprooted grumbled and delayed and begged to be spared, and were not. The Tsar's plan admitted no appeal, and a family that had measured its consequence in Moscow for 300 years might find itself ordered to sink its whole fortune into piles and stone on a fog-bound island at the edge of the world. What rose there was meant to be everything Moscow was not. Where the old capital had sprawled for centuries in a labyrinth of crooked lanes and onion domes, St. Petersburg was drawn with a straight edge. Long, open prospects, canals cut in the Dutch manner, colonnaded facades that breathed the air of Amsterdam and of the great courts of the West. The very waterways were to be disciplined, channeled, embanked, and ruled into straight lines, bent to the same geometry as the streets. It was a deliberate importation, a fragment of Europe set down in a swamp, and to the envoys who came to it by sea, it seemed scarcely believable, a geometric western-facing capital standing where, a decade earlier, there had been only reeds and gulls, the ships of the new Baltic fleet riding at anchor before it. And through the scaffolding and the rain moved the Tsar himself, his enormous frame unmistakable, even at a distance, driving the work as he drove all things, by the flat of his authority and the shadow of the knout, treating the raising of his capital as a campaign in which the losses were to be borne as the losses of war. Yet for all its imported splendor, the city was only a surface. It was the outward sign of a rupture Peter meant to drive through the whole of Russian life, and that rupture was as yet far from made. His nobles wore German coats now and had lost their long robes, and the port kept a new and foreign time. But past the embankments, the empire he ruled still belonged to another age, its faith and its customs and its very counting of the years unchanged since the days of his grandfathers. A capital of stone might face the west as boldly as it liked. The country behind it had not yet been made to turn. He had built a European city on a Baltic swamp and paid for it in a multitude of lives that no ledger ever fully counted. But a window to the west looked out on nothing if the house behind it remained old Muscovy, its years still numbered from the creation of the world, its church a power to rival the throne, its men still hidden behind beards and long robes and the certainties of their grandfathers. The city was only the first stone. Now Peter turned on Russia itself, on its calendar, its faith, and its very face, and began to break the old world apart with his hands. The Tsar, who came home from the shipyards of the West in the late summer of 1698, had seen how the modern world built its power, and he had returned with a bruising impatience for everything that kept his own country from it. To Peter, the old Russia was not simply quaint or slow, it was an obstacle to survival, a heavy inheritance of ritual and custom that in his judgment left his people blind to the strength they might command. He did not set out to reform that world by persuasion or by degrees. He set out to break it, and he broke it with the instruments nearest to his hand, the decree, the tax, the shears, and the knout. He began with time itself. For as long as anyone could remember, the Russian year had been counted from the supposed creation of the world, a reckoning that set the nation apart from every court he had visited, and the year had opened not in the dead of winter, but on the 1st of September, with the gathering of the harvest. In the last days of December 1699, Peter simply ordered the calendar forward. By his decree, the new year would begin on the 1st of January, and the years would henceforth be numbered from the birth of Christ, as they were in the West. At a stroke he cut the tether that held Russia to its medieval past, and pulled the whole nation overnight into the current of European time. Those who clung to the old count were left, quite literally, in another year from their Tsar. If the calendar was the soul of the old world, the beard was its face. To the devout and to the great boyar families, The beard was a mark of piety and of orthodox manhood, worn in the image of the saints, and not lightly surrendered. To Peter, it was the most visible badge of the backwardness he meant to abolish, and he attacked it head-on. He laid a tax upon the wearing of beards, and, to any man who paid for the privilege of keeping his, the state issued a small bronze token, a beard token stamped and carried as a receipt, to be produced on demand as proof that the price of defiance had been met. The token was stamped with the image of a beard itself, a small bronze absurdity that a grown man of ancient family might be made to show at a city gate to keep the hair on his own face. The same compulsion reached to the clothes on a nobleman's back. Peter despised the long robes and the wide trailing sleeves of the old Russian dress, and he decreed the western coat in their place. Patterns of the new garments were hung up at the gates of the cities for all to copy, and guards were set there with authority to shorten, on the spot, the robes and sleeves of any man who came in still wearing the old fashion, so that the proudest men in the kingdom might walk into the capital with their clothes cut ragged and their dignity trimmed away in public. Those who resisted were fined, branded, driven into exile. To the common people, and above all to the old believers who saw in this westernizing fury a sign of the last days, the Tsar who tore up their calendar and shaved their faces could be nothing but the Antichrist. The terror lay not only in the punishments, it lay in the sense that the very face and rhythm of a people were being erased by a will that acknowledged no history but its own. Then he turned to the heart of the old order, the Church. For centuries, the Patriarch of Moscow had stood beside the throne as a rival majesty, a spiritual sovereign whose authority was older than the Romanov line, and who might, on occasion, check the Tsar himself. When the last patriarch died in 1700, Peter appointed no successor. He simply left the throne of the Church empty and governed its affairs for 2 decades through a caretaker of his own choosing. Then, in 1721, he made the arrangement permanent. By the spiritual regulation, drafted for him by the churchman Feofan Prokopovich, who supplied the theology to justify it, he abolished the patriarchate outright and put in its place a holy governing synod, a board of clergy supervised by a lay official and answerable in every particular to the crown. The church that had crowned the Tsars became a department of the state. Its pulpits carried the Tsar's decrees to the villages, its authority was folded into his own, and the throne was set finally and deliberately above the altar. To govern the swelling, straining empire, Peter tore out the old Muscovite machinery of administration, the tangle of overlapping chancelleries, the prikazy with their corruption and their delays, and built a new apparatus in its place. In 1711 he created the Senate, a supreme council to rule in his name whenever the wars carried him away from the centre so that the state might run without him. He replaced the chaos of the prikazy with colleges, specialized ministries on the Western model, each charged with a single field: foreign affairs, war, justice, finance, commerce, governed by written rule and settled hierarchy rather than by the whim of a boyar council. Where the old order had trusted to birth and to the long memory of who took precedence over whom, the new one trusted to paper, to the register, the regulation, and the written report against which a man could be measured and held. And in 1722 he issued the most radical instrument of all. The table of ranks sorted every servant of the state, military, civil, and court, into 14 graded steps, and it fixed a man's standing, not by the antiquity of his name, but by the rank he had reached in service. Under it a man of the lowest birth might climb by talent and labour to a nobility his grandfathers could never have imagined. The very ladder that had already carried his favourite Menshikov from nothing to the summit of the realm. It threw open the doors of the establishment to men who would once have been invisible, and it bound the whole of that new service class in loyalty to the Tsar who had raised them. He did not stop at the machinery of power. He gave Russia its first newspaper, the Vedomosti, begun in 1703, to carry his victories and his instructions to whoever could read them. He founded the Kunstkamera, the country's first public museum, and filled it with the instruments and curiosities he had gathered abroad, compelling his subjects to look at the world through the lens of anatomy and mechanics and natural science. He ordered a reformed, simplified civil script, stripping the ornate old church letters from everyday print to make reading and writing serviceable to the state, and he planted the first of the new schools that were to supply his offices and his fleet with trained men. Every reform reached for the same end, a Russia that could be counted, taught, taxed, and commanded like the nations of the West. And every one of these changes was imposed, and every one left a wake of resentment. The nobility, shorn of their robes and their old independence, found themselves bound to a lifetime of compulsory service they had never sought. The peasantry, taxed and levied to pay for the new state and to build it, watched their inherited way of life dismantled by a ruler who seemed to belong to another world. Many were certain the end of days itself was at hand, and answered the new age by fleeing into the forests, or deeper into the old belief, or into a sullen endurance that would outlast the Tsar who had imposed it upon them. And yet, for all the fear and the branding and the knout, the machine ran. Cold, efficient, and never still, it was built to project power, and it did. Both things were true at once, and they must be held in the same hand. A nation genuinely remade and a nation remade by force. By decree, a man could now be born a peasant and die a nobleman. By decree, the church that had crowned the Tsars became a department of the state. By decree, the very year changed its number, and the beard fell from the Russian face. Peter had remade his country on paper and in law, and much of what he wrote down would outlive him by 200 years. But paper does not stop an army, and out of the West, the one man he still feared was coming at last. Charles of Sweden had finished with Poland, and had turned the whole weight of his veteran army toward the heart of Russia. Everything Peter had built was about to stand or fall on a single summer's day near a town called Poltava. The war that had consumed the first decade of the century was, at bottom, a collision between two wholly different kinds of power. On one side stood Charles XII of Sweden, a king who had come to his throne as a boy, and had spent his youth proving himself perhaps the finest soldier in Europe, a commander who moved his armies at the speed of rumour, struck like a rapier, and in 8 years of war had never once been beaten. On the other stood the Tsar of Russia, the giant who had spent those same years building a nation out of the mud. Peter had been humiliated by this same Swede at the very start of the war at Narva, where his raw, half-trained regiments had been shredded in a single afternoon by the Swedish professionals. He had learned from that disaster more than any victory could have taught him, but he had not forgotten its lesson, and he knew he was still not the equal of Charles on an open field. So when the Swedish king turned the full weight of his veteran army toward the Russian heartland in the summer of 1708, Peter refused to give him the battle he wanted. Instead, he drew the Swedes deeper into the vast and roadless interior, and as they advanced, he had the country stripped bare before them. By his order, the villages along the line of march were burned, the granaries emptied or fired, the wells fouled, the forage carried off. The pride of the Swedish army, tens of thousands of the hardest veterans in Europe, marched on, into a widening wasteland of ash and began, slowly, to starve. It was a war of deliberate devastation, patient and cold, and Peter waited on its edges for the Swedish momentum to fail before he would risk a general engagement. Space he had in abundance, and time, he spent them both to bleed an enemy he dared not yet meet head-on. It was a strategy that fell as heavily on his own people as on the invader, for the villages that burned were Russian villages, and the grain that vanished was Russian grain. But Peter had shown before, and would show again, that he would spend his subjects without flinching to gain his ends. The turn came in the autumn of 1708 at a village called Lesnaya. A great Swedish supply train, the guns, the powder, the food, and the reinforcements under General Löwenhaupt, on which the whole campaign depended, was intercepted by Peter's forces as it laboured east to join the king. The fighting ran across 2 hard days, and by its end the Swedish lifeline had been cut to pieces. Peter, who was present at the battle, would afterward call the victory at Lesnaya the mother of Poltava, a phrase long remembered as his. For the loss of a supply train it was a heavy word, but the judgment held: an army that cannot be fed cannot fight, and the guns and powder swallowed in the mud at Lesnaya were losses the Swedes could never make good so far from home. It was the moment the tide began to ebb. Stripped of his supplies and facing the onset of one of the cruelest winters in living memory, Charles abandoned the direct road to Moscow and swung south into Ukraine, gambling everything on the promised support of the Cossack hetman, Ivan Mazepa. Mazepa had been the Tsar's trusted servant for 20 years, a man of learning and vast influence whom Peter had loaded with honours. But his loyalty had become a shadow of itself. He had been in secret dealing with the Swedish king for months, wagering that Peter's new order would collapse and that he might raise a sovereign Ukraine from its wreckage. When Charles arrived, he found far fewer Cossacks under Mazepa's hand than he had been promised, and a countryside that offered little of the refuge he had been led to expect. The winter of 1708 into 1709 became a slow execution of the Swedish army by cold and hunger. Men died by the thousand in the frost, and when at last the spring came, the force that had once been thought invincible was a gaunt and shivering remnant, ill-clothed, ill-fed, and desperately short of powder. In the early summer of 1709, the trap closed. Charles laid siege to Poltava, a modest fortress town that lay across his path, in a bid to force upon the Russians the battle they had spent a year denying him. But before the siege could even take hold, the king's famous luck deserted him. Riding too near the Russian lines to scout them, he was struck in the foot by a bullet that shattered the bone, and the greatest field commander of his age was reduced to directing the coming battle from a litter carried among his men, his legendary presence on the field replaced by a wounded and static figure. Peter, meanwhile, had come up with an army transformed by a decade of relentless, punishing labour. Gone were the undisciplined levies of Narva. In their place stood a professional standing army, drilled hard in the Western manner and backed by a powerful train of artillery that the Tsar had built and marshalled himself. When the two hosts at last faced one another on a June morning in 1709, the disparity was plain. Peter's army was large, well-fed and well-gunned, and it outnumbered the starving Swedes by a wide margin, the Russians in the tens of thousands, the Swedish field army now reduced to something between 17 and 20-odd thousand, of whom fewer still could actually be brought into the fight. The battle was decided in a matter of hours. The Swedish infantry, so long the terror of the continent, flung themselves forward with all their old ferocity, coming on across open ground and through a line of earthen redoubts that split and bled their columns long before they reached the Russian main body. What arrived at the guns was already half broken, and there it was met by disciplined volleys and by a devastating sustained cannonade that Peter had ranged across the field with care. The Swedish line broke under the weight of Russian iron. By midday, the army that had marched into Russia to end Peter's reign was no longer an army but a rout hunted across the plain. Charles, wounded and borne on his litter, barely escaped, fleeing south toward the Ottoman frontier. A few days later, the remnant of his once proud force, cornered against the Dnieper at Perevolozhna, surrendered en masse without another fight, and Mazeppa fled with his king into Turkish exile. In the reckoning that followed, the scale of what had happened became clear. A field army that had terrorized the continent for a generation had been killed, scattered, or marched into captivity in the span of a few days. The myth of Swedish invincibility had burned away in the heat of a single Russian summer. Moving among the captured Swedish generals at his victory feast, Peter, by the accounts of those who were present, did not treat them as beaten enemies, but honored them, raising his cup and thanking them for the schooling they had given him at Narva and after, and naming them his teachers in the art of war. Whatever passed in the man that day, the gesture measured the distance he had travelled, from the impulsive Tsar routed on the snow at Narva to the master of a disciplined war machine that had just destroyed the finest army in Europe. The giant had come of age in the fires of the Great Northern War. He had taken a mass of ill-armed, ill-trained, and beaten men and forged them into an instrument of state, and the reforms he had driven through with the knout, the compulsory service, the foreign training, the crushing taxes that paid for his guns, had returned their dividend on a single field. The machine worked. The map had shifted, and Russia, so lately dismissed as a backward power on the margins of Europe, now stood as a titan of the north, while the empire that had lately been the terror of the Baltic began, that morning, to fall. What Narva had been for Russia, a byword for humiliation, Poltava now became for Sweden, and the two names would be spoken together for centuries after, the fall answering the rout. In a single morning near Poltava, the map of Europe turned on its axis. The Empire of Sweden began to die, and the Empire of Russia was born. The fugitive Charles would spend 5 sullen years in a Turkish exile, and Peter would never again fear for his throne on any battlefield. And yet the Tsar, who had just made himself master of the north, owed his steadiest hours not to a general or a minister, but to a woman who had been washing other people's linen when the war began. A captured servant girl with no name that Russia knew. Before she was an empress, she had been the spoils of war. The steadiest hours of the Tsar's life belonged, in the end, not to a victory or a fleet or any favourite of state, but rather to the woman who had walked into his life through the wreckage of a Baltic war. She had been born, most likely around 1684, in the humid and uncertain borderland of Livonia, a province forever caught between the appetites of Sweden and Russia. Her name, then, was Marta Skavronskaya, and her early years are written in the anonymous shorthand of the peasantry. No record of the day, no certainty even of the place. She was orphaned young and raised in service, a maid and washerwoman in the household of a Lutheran pastor named Gluck in the town of Marienburg, where her days were spent scrubbing, stitching, and hauling water. She was, by every account that survives her, a woman of the soil, unlettered, hardy, and wholly without pedigree. Women of her station left behind neither portraits nor letters, and passed through the world unrecorded. They entered history, if they entered it at all, only on the day some greater power reached down and lifted them out of the anonymous mass. For most of her early life, nothing whatever marked Marta Skavronskaya for such a fate. A brief and shadowy first marriage to a Swedish dragoon was over almost before it began? He marched away into the opening months of the Great Northern War and vanished from the record altogether, leaving no one who could say for certain whether he lived or died. In the summer of 1702, the war came to Marienburg. When the Russian army stormed the town, the ordinary world of its inhabitants was simply extinguished, and Marta was swept up among the prisoners. One more piece of human plunder among thousands. In the taking of a town, the victors carried off what they pleased, and captured women were reckoned among the spoils, no different in law from the plate and the horses. That she survived the sack at all, and was not simply lost within it, she owed to the notice of the men who now claimed her. She passed first into the keeping of the Field Marshal Boris Sheremetev, and then, through the web of patronage that bound the Tsar's inner circle, into the household of Alexander Menshikov. Menshikov was the very opposite of the old bearded boyars who had once filled the Kremlin. He was a man risen from nothing, the boy said to have hawked meat pies in the streets of Moscow before his path crossed that of a restless young Tsar, and he had become a creature of pure, kinetic ambition, gifted with the rare art of reading Peter's mind a moment before Peter had made it up. He was the Tsar's right hand and his mirror, and in time his most flagrant thief. When his eye fell on the captured servant from Marienburg, he saw a prize worth setting before his master. What Peter found in her, the men around him struggled to name, for it was not the beauty a court expected of a favourite. It was something rarer, and it showed itself in the plainest of ways. She could be near him. Peter was a man of terrifying contradictions, a giant who could order the march of armies and the raising of fleets, and yet was too often at the mercy of his own nature. The convulsions that seized his face and frightened those who saw them, the sudden volcanic rages, the sheer punishing speed at which he lived, these emptied the rooms around him. Catherine, as she would soon be called, did not empty. Where others fled his outbursts or stood trembling before them, she alone, contemporaries observed, could sit through them and quiet him. She could soothe the fits that unnerved his court and stay steady before a temper that scattered everyone else. She became his constant companion, riding beside him on the long and brutal campaigns, sharing the damp of the tents and the coarse bread of the field. She asked, by every account, for none of the pampering a mistress might have claimed, and gave instead the one thing he could find nowhere else in his empire, the plain ability to endure him. She was baptized into the Orthodox faith and took the name Catherine Alexeyevna, and the patronymic came with an irony that later years would sharpen from her godfather, the Tsarevich Alexei, Peter's own son. She bore the Tsar many children, but the 18th century was as merciless to the house of the Tsar as to the meanest hut, and most of them died in infancy. Only 2 daughters lived through their earliest years, Anna, born in 1708, and Elizabeth, born in 1709. The burying of infants was the common lot of that century, born in the palace no less than in the hut, and Catherine bore it while she followed the drum, carrying and losing children on the very roads down which she rode to war at his side. They were doted upon by their father, but they were not sons. They could not carry the sceptre he was forging, nor secure the succession of the new Russia he was building at such cost. Beside Catherine rose Menshikov, the man who had begun with nothing and now bore the title of Serene Prince. He was a field marshal of the Tsar's armies and the first governor of the new capital rising from the marshes, and he wielded his offices with a greed that startled even the hardened men of that court. He plundered the treasury, took bribes in broad daylight, and raised for himself a palace to rival his master's, and through all of it remained ferociously unshakably loyal to the Tsar who had made him. More than once the Tsar's own auditors caught his hand deep in the treasury and fined him sums that would have broken a lesser man. And more than once Peter, who could not do without him, took back the money and left him his offices. Together the washerwoman and the pie-seller's boy embodied the new order Peter was imposing on the world, an order in which blood counted for less than use, in which the Tsar's favour was the only patent of nobility that finally mattered. They were the low-born lifted high, the living proof of a ruler who had raised his greatest servants from the dust and never troubled to hide it. In 1712, Peter set the seal on the union in a public marriage, raising the servant of Marienburg to the standing of his wife, though the two had been bound together by most accounts for years before the ceremony made it law. It was a defiant act, a deliberate affront to the old aristocratic families who looked on the former laundress with cold and silent contempt. To those families, to seat a captured Livonian servant beside the Romanov throne came very near to sacrilege, but it was of a piece with a reign that had already made a prince of a pie-seller and conjured a fleet out of a marsh. He had built a new navy, a new capital, a new machinery of state, and it was of a piece with everything else that he should build a new family to match from the very bottom of the world. He had shorn the beards of his nobles and dressed them in foreign coats. He had torn out the ancient, slow-turning gears of Muscovy and replaced them with the Senate and the colleges. By every outward measure, the labour of his life was succeeding. And yet a shadow lay across even the wedding bells. The throne of Russia would need an heir, and its heir was not the child of the woman who now stood at Peter's side. The boy who waited in the wings of the court was the son of Eudoxia, the first wife Peter had cast off and shut away in a distant convent years before. He had been raised in the lingering, quiet, deeply traditional air of the old Russia. A boy who had watched his father tear down the world of his forefathers with a mounting fear and confusion, and who belonged not to the camp or the shipyard, but to the very past his father had sworn to abolish. In him, the old Russia that Peter was breaking had found, without intending to, a living heir. From a wash-tub in a Baltic village to the bed of the Tsar of all the Russias, no one in the empire had climbed so far from so little, unless it was the pie-seller's boy who had handed her to him. Peter had built himself a new family from the very bottom of the world, as he was building everything else. But Catherine gave him daughters, and the son who stood to inherit the throne he was forging had been born long before her. The child of the wife he had locked away in a convent, a quiet, frightened boy who loved the old Russia his father had sworn to destroy. His name was Alexei, and he was the one thing in the empire that Peter could not remake. The dream of a southern sea had haunted Peter for as long as he had reached for the northern one, and in the summer of 1711 it drew him into the single greatest humiliation of his maturity. The exiled Charles XII, sheltering in Ottoman territory after Poltava, had spent his idle years pressing his case at the Sultan's court, and at last, the pressure told, the Ottoman Empire declared war on Russia. Peter answered by marching south into the Moldavian lands, carrying with him the conviction that the Orthodox Christians under Ottoman rule would rise at his approach and greet his army as deliverers. He looked for a general rising, a holy war that would carry him toward the heart of the Turkish power, and he staked the safety of the Tsar himself on its coming. The rising never came. As the Russian columns pushed deep toward the Danube, they found no armies of grateful liberators but empty country, failing supplies, and a summer heat that wore the men down faster than any enemy. By July, the Tsar and the bulk of his field army were pinned against the Pruth River, encircled near Stanilesht by an Ottoman force several times their number. For the first time since Narva, Peter stood on the edge of a catastrophe. And this time the catastrophe was not the loss of a battle, but the loss of the Tsar in the field, taken with his whole empire leaderless behind him. He had come south certain of destiny and found himself cut off, surrounded, and starving under a pitiless sun, with no road out that did not run through the Ottoman lines. Salvation came at the price of everything he had won in the south. By the terms forced upon him, Peter gave back the fortress of Azov, the prize of his first campaigns. He agreed to break up the fleet he had labored for years to build on the southern waters and to raise the forts he had raised along that coast. It was a bitter and comprehensive reversal, undoing at a stroke the work of a decade and a half. In the years that followed, a story took root that the Empress Catherine, who had travelled with the army, had gathered up her jewels and the silver of the court to buy off the Grand Vizier and purchase the army's escape. It is a legend, a romantic gloss laid over a colder transaction. The Ottomans let the Russians go because they had won what they sought without a final, grinding battle. And it should be named as legend and set aside. Peter escaped with his life and his crown, but the southern door he had forced open at Azov 15 years before had swung shut again, and it would stay shut for the rest of his reign. The dream of a southern empire he left behind in the mud of the Pruth. He did not linger over the defeat. With the south closed to him, he turned back to the Baltic with a concentrated fury, and there his reach was still lengthening. The war with Sweden had settled into a long grind of siege and manoeuvre, a slow wearing of steel against stone. But Peter now possessed a thing no earlier Tsar had ever held, a navy of his own. He drove the shipyards of his new capital without mercy, building not only ships of the line but a great fleet of galleys, oar-driven craft suited to the rocks and shoals and shallow channels of the northern coast. In 1714, off the Hango Peninsula in the coastal waters of Finland, that fleet fought its first great battle. At Hango, Gangut in the Russian telling, the galleys rowed through the calms and the narrows where the heavier Swedish sailing ships lay, becalmed and could not follow, closed with the enemy, and carried them by boarding. It was the first major victory of the Russian navy, and it opened the war for the first time into Swedish home waters. With it, the Baltic provinces of Livonia and Estonia passed firmly into Peter's grip, and Finland lay open beneath his hand. In the years that followed, Russian squadrons ranged through the northern archipelago and carried the fighting onto the Swedish coast itself, until the war that had opened with the rout of a Russian army at Narva was being waged within sight of the enemy's own shore. The sea he had bled for was becoming at last a Russian sea. Russia could no longer be dismissed as a backward country on the margins of events. It had become a power that could carry its will across open water and compel the older states of Europe to reckon with it, and Peter set about binding his new empire into their world by treaty and by marriage, fitting his house to the ruling families of the German north, so that the dynasty of a country lately dismissed as half barbarous now took its place among the royal houses of the continent. And as the war ground toward its close, he began to move through the West in a wholly new character. He had first gone abroad 2 decades before as a disguised student, a giant pretending to be a carpenter. Now, in the second great tour of 1716 and 1717, he travelled as a sovereign among sovereigns. He passed through the German states and the Dutch Republic he had loved as a young man, and came at last to Paris, to the court that stood at the centre of European fashion and power. The reception measured how far he had come. The same courts that had once laughed at the rough, restless Carpenter now received him with awe and a certain aristocratic unease. In Paris he walked the gardens of Versailles, inspected the workshops and the military academies, sat in the theatres and the halls of the learned, and drew every eye in every room he entered, curious, restless, and wholly himself amid the powdered formality of the French court. One much-repeated account tells how, presented to the child king Louis XV, Peter reached down and swept the little boy up into his arms, a gesture read at once as warmth between crowned heads and as the plain ease of a man who now counted himself the equal of any throne in Europe. The story is well attested, and it belongs to the lighter side of a heavy life. Whatever passed in that room, the Tsar the West had mocked was now a guest. The West took care to honor. Behind the triumphs, the war itself was nearly spent. Sweden had been bled white by 20 years of fighting and would soon lose Charles himself. It could no longer hold the Baltic against the power Peter had built. In the quiet corridors of diplomacy, the shape of a settlement was forming, the terms that would in time become the Peace of Nystad, by which Sweden would surrender the Northern Sea and acknowledge the new order Peter had forced into being. Everything the Tsar had reached toward across a lifetime was coming, finally, within his grasp. The harbours, the fleet, the standing of a great power, the recognition of Europe. And yet the more he seized, the heavier one absence grew. An empire is built to be handed on, and the question of who would inherit this one had begun to press on Peter with a weight the victories could not lift. He had remade the state, the army, the fleet, the very calendar and faith of his people. He had not been able to remake the one man who stood to inherit all of it. His son Alexei had been born to the wife Peter had shut away in a convent and had grown into the living image of the old Russia the father had sworn to destroy, devout, fearful, and drawn to everything Peter despised. The Tsar's letters to him had grown colder and more threatening with the years, demands to reform or be cast aside that fell away into silence. He had made himself master of the North and could not order his own household. For all his command of the sea and the state, this was the one problem no decree could settle and no army could take by storm, and the shadow of that single failure lengthened across every triumph he won. Peter had reached the sea he had bled his whole life for. His ships now sailed where only Sweden's had dared, and the courts of Europe that had mocked a carpenter received him as an emperor in all but name. He had seized nearly everything a single life could seize. But a man builds an empire in order to hand it on, and the only hand he had to give it to was his son's. And his son had come to hate everything the empire stood for. In the winter of 1716, rather than inherit his father's Russia, the Tsarevich Alexei did the one thing no one had dared imagine. He ran. The boy was born in 1690 into the old world his father had only begun to take apart. Alexei Petrovich was the son of Peter and Eudoxia Lopukina, the wife the young Tsar had married early and without affection. A woman of the traditional Moscow nobility, chosen for her blood and her piety and prized by Peter for neither. The marriage had been a mismatch from the first. Peter had no patience for the slow, candle-lit devotions of the old court, and even less for a wife who embodied them, and when Alexei was 8 years old, his mother was taken from him and shut behind convent walls. Her place as the Tsar's wife ended at the stroke of a pen. The boy was left to the care of his aunts and of the conservative churchmen and courtiers who surrounded the throne's older world, men who watched Peter's reforms with something close to grief. To that circle, the child was more than an heir. He was their hope that the whole violent experiment might one day be undone, that a later reign might restore the beards and the calendar and the quiet authority of the church, and they raised the Tsarevich to be everything his father was not. He was steeped in the old prayers and the old chronicles, in the ceremony of a court his father had abandoned, and he grew to love precisely the Russia that Peter had set himself to erase. In this they succeeded entirely. Alexei grew into a quiet, bookish, deeply devout young man, at home among icons and manuscripts and ill at ease amid the noise of the shipyard and the brutality of the drill field. He was, in his very person, a reproach to the transformation his father was driving through the country, and Peter saw it and did not see a son so much as a failure of his own will. He set himself to force the boy into his own image, commanding him to master the sciences of war and government, to inspect the naval works, to take up the cold, practical modernity the Tsar had willed into being. Alexei obeyed, but he obeyed as one performing a penance, dragging through each task under the weight of his father's expectation. Some contemporaries reported that during one inspection the Tsarevich deliberately fired a pistol through his own hand, hoping that a wound might spare him the duties his father pressed upon him. The story may be a dark tale of the court and cannot be verified, but whether it happened or not, it caught the truth of their estrangement plainly enough. That the son would sooner injure himself than become the heir, the father demanded. Everything that drew the father repelled the son, and everything the son held sacred the father had marked for destruction. There was no ground left on which the two of them could meet. His marriage did nothing to close the distance between them. In 1711 Alexei was wed to a German princess, Charlotte of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, in one of the dynastic matches by which Peter was binding his house to the courts of Europe. It was a union of two strangers who found little in one another but a shared unhappiness, and it was brief. Charlotte died in 1715, only days after bearing a son, the child who would one day reign as Peter II. By a cruel coincidence of the calendar, that very year Peter's own second wife, Catherine, the former washerwoman, raised to the Tsar's side, gave birth to a son of her own. With a new male heir breathing in the palace, the estranged Alexei ceased to be merely a disappointment and became an obstacle. Peter began to speak of the succession with a cold finality. In a series of letters that survive, he warned his son that he would cut him off from the throne as a surgeon cuts away a gangrenous limb for the health of the whole body, unless the Tsarevich either truly reformed his character or renounced the world altogether and took the vows of a monk. Those letters survive in the Tsar's own hand, and they are among the coldest documents the reign left behind. A father setting out point by point the terms on which he would keep or discard his son. To Peter this was not cruelty but the arithmetic of a state's survival. He would not leave the labour of his life to a man who, in his eyes, would let it rot within a single generation. He demanded a decision, and he pressed for it as he pressed for everything, without relenting. The choice he laid before his son was, in truth, scarcely a choice at all: to become another man entirely, or to be buried alive in a monastery and sign away his birthright with his own hand. Cornered between a reform he could not manage and a monastery he did not want, Alexei chose a third road that no one had foreseen. He chose to run. In the autumn of 1716 he slipped away from the court and fled westward into the heart of Europe, throwing himself on the protection of his brother-in-law, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, the one man on the continent with the power to shelter a runaway from the Tsar of Russia. It was a desperate flight. Alexei travelled in secret and took with him his mistress, a common girl named Afrosinia, whom he kept at his side by disguising her among his servants. The emperor, unwilling either to surrender the prince or to provoke a war with the master of the north, hid him away, first in the mountain fortress of Marienburg in the Tyrol, and then far to the south near Naples, while the Russian court searched Europe for its vanished heir. It was an intolerable position for the Habsburg court, sheltering a fugitive whose father would not rest until he was found, and the diplomatic pressure to give him up mounted with every month that passed. To the courts of Europe it was an extraordinary spectacle. The heir to the Russian throne, a fugitive from his own father, moved from one hiding place to the next, while the most powerful ruler in the north demanded his surrender. For a season the Tsarevich lived in suspension, a crown prince in hiding, waiting for a safety that would never come. But Peter was not a man to let a runaway son dictate the future of his throne, and he sent after him the most subtle of his servants, the diplomat Peter Tolstoy. Tolstoy was a creature of the new age, patient and without scruple, and he set about the slow work of breaking the prince's resolve, not at first with force, but with words. He did not need the knout. He worked instead by turns of pressure and reassurance, threatening what refusal would bring and promising what surrender might buy. That if Alexei would only come home, his father would forgive him everything, that he would be free to marry his Afrosinia, that he might lay down all claim to the throne and live quietly on a country estate, out of the reach of the court that had crushed him. He carried with him a written promise of pardon under the Tsar's own hand, and he pressed it week after week upon a man who wanted nothing in the world so much as to believe it. For months the diplomat worked at him, wearing down each fear and each objection in turn, until the promise of a quiet life came to seem more solid than the danger that waited for him at its end. It was among the oldest snares in the history of power, and the frightened, exhausted prince was in no condition to see the iron beneath the velvet. He weighed the crushing certainty of his father's will against the fragile promise of peace, and he chose the promise. He gave up the emperor's protection and turned his face back toward the east, trading the uncertain safety of exile for the certain authority of his father, and Afrosinia travelled with him. The one tie to happiness he still held, and, though he could not have known it, the very witness whose later testimony would help to condemn him. With each mile eastward, the promises grew thinner, and the reach of the Russian state grew nearer, closing around him as quietly and as surely as ice sealing over a river. Tolstoy had promised him, in the Tsar's own name and in writing, that if he came home and confessed everything he would be forgiven, left in peace to marry his girl and live quietly in the country. Alexei believed it, because he wanted so desperately to believe it, and he crossed back into Russia and knelt before his father and surrendered the pardon on paper. The pardon was a lie. What waited for the Tsarevich was not a country estate, but a stone room in the fortress his father had raised on the bones of the poor, and the men who worked in that fortress did not deal in forgiveness. The price of the pardon was not obedience alone, it was confession, total and without reserve. Alexei had crossed back into Russia, believing that surrender would buy him a quiet life, that a father's outstretched hand meant mercy. He had not grasped that the man who had summoned him home was no longer a father weighing a wayward son, but a head of state who saw in the flight itself the living shape of everything he had spent 30 years trying to burn out of Russia. In returning, Alexei had not ended the danger. He had carried it back with him through the fortress gate. The homecoming he had imagined as the end of his ordeal was only the beginning of it. The apparatus of the state set to work at once. To earn the forgiveness he had been promised, the Tsarevich was required to give up every name, every man who had sheltered his hopes, murmured against the reforms or dreamed with him of a different Russia. What followed was a widening cascade of arrests that ran through the capital and reached far out into the provinces. The old Russia party, the quiet sympathizers who had watched the prince's resistance with secret hope, were gathered up now by the very machinery that had remade the army and broken the church to the throne. Men who had done no more than listen to the Tsarevich or pray for a gentler reign found themselves seized and questioned. Sympathy itself had become a crime. Confessions drawn from one man supplied the names of the next, and the circle of the accused spread outward through the clergy and the old nobility until half the world Alexei had come from stood under suspicion. The terror that had once been turned outward against the Streltsy and the old world turned inward upon the Tsar's own court and at last upon the Tsar's own blood. It reached even Eudoxia. Alexei's mother, the wife Peter had shut in a convent 20 years before, was drawn out of her seclusion and questioned about her associations and her hopes. The small, still world she had built inside her confinement was pulled apart, and a man of her circle, Glebov, was put to death. The intent beneath the proceedings was plain and deliberate. There was no cloister remote enough, no bond old enough or intimate enough to lie beyond the reach of the Tsar's scrutiny, and the investigators meant not only to gather the truth, but to teach a lesson with it. That in the new Russia, nothing whatever stood outside the state. The father who had broken the Streltsy and shaved the boyars and silenced the patriarch would break, if it came to it, the woman he had once married and the son she had borne him. As the arrests widened, the affair moved toward its appointed end. Peter referred his son not to the ordinary courts, but to a special tribunal of the realm's high men, churchmen, and secular officials convened to sit in judgment on the heir. The clergy, asked for their counsel, returned a divided and cautious answer, laying scripture on both sides of the scale, the passages of the old law that condemned a rebellious son, and the words of the gospel that urged mercy and forgiveness, set before the Tsar without a verdict, as though the churchmen dared neither to absolve the prince nor to sign his death. It was left to the laymen to speak plainly. These were the men who had risen through Peter's new order and owed their rank and their fortune wholly to him, and they understood what was required of them. In June of 1718, by the accounts that survive, more than 100 of them, a number most often given as 127, set their names to a sentence of death for high treason. The Tsarevich, they declared, had betrayed both his sovereign and his father, and for a crime of that magnitude the law knew but one penalty. Not one of them, it seems, was willing to be the man who stood between the Tsar and the son he had already resolved to condemn. The sentence was pronounced, and still the questioning did not stop. In the days after the condemnation, while Alexei was held within the walls of the Peter and Paul fortress, he was put to the knout, not once, but twice within the same short span, brought again before the interrogators to answer for the last hidden corners of the conspiracy. By the record he received some 25 strokes in the first session, and further strokes in the second. These were not trials in any sense a court of law would recognize. They were the final effort of a government determined to wring the last secret from a man already condemned and already failing in health before he could carry it beyond its reach. Whatever confessions such a process produced, it produced them by pain, and every word set down in those last days must be read in that light. Contemporary accounts and the foreign observers who wrote of the reign with a mixture of fascination and hostility reported that the Tsar himself was present while his son was questioned. Whether Peter stood in that chamber and watched, whether he ordered it, oversaw it, or merely knew of it and let it proceed, cannot now be established. The secrecy of the fortress and the evident bias of those who set down the tale have left it beyond proof. It is a charge that has shadowed his memory ever since, and it can be neither confirmed nor honestly dismissed. What is certain is only the ending. On the 26th of June, 1718, 2 days after the second flogging, the Tsarevich Alexei died within the fortress walls in the new capital his father had raised. He was 28 years old, and he died a prisoner in the city his father had built to be the emblem of the future that had no place in it for him. The court's account was brief and clinical. The prince had been carried off by an apoplectic fit, a sudden seizure that no care could arrest. Beneath that official cause the truth has never been recovered, and in all likelihood never will be. Whether Alexei died of the cumulative effects of the punishment, of an illness hastened by his imprisonment and his fear, or whether he was quietly put to death in his cell to spare the throne the scandal of a public execution of its own heir, is debated to this day and cannot be resolved. The evidence that survives is testimony taken under coercion and the threat of the knout, words extracted, not freely given, and it can settle nothing. Historians have argued the question for 3 centuries and reached no agreement. The honest answer is that the manner of the prince's death is unknown and will remain so. Whatever passed in that stone room passed out of history with the man who died in it, and the rain kept its secret close. The aftermath was as cold as the death. Peter, who had never in his life known how to be still, who lived for the next campaign and the next decree, did not pause. He commanded no period of mourning. He left behind no word of a father's grief that history has been able to find. Instead, the court of St. Petersburg held services of thanksgiving, and the machinery of the state shifted its weight and moved on as though the death of the heir had been one more correction to the empire's forward course. There were no bells rung in grief and no days of mourning proclaimed. The heir who had carried the hopes of the old world into the fortress was buried, and the reign turned at once to the next thing before it. To those who watched, the meaning was unmistakable. The remaking of Russia was a work that stood above the lives of individual men, and it would not be halted by any of them, though he wore the blood of the Tsar. The old Russia had found in Alexei its last and best hope, and that hope had been extinguished behind the fortress walls. In destroying his son, Peter had cut the final tie to the world he was resolved to erase, and the cost of the new empire had at last come home to his own house. He had broken old Russia in its churches and its calendars and its beards, and now he had broken it in the body of his only grown son, and the price of the new empire had been paid in full. Peter ordered no mourning. Within days the court was toasting other things, for there was a war finally ending and a triumph coming that would crown everything the terror had bought. In 3 years' time, the Senate would stand before the giant and offer him a title no Russian ruler had ever borne. And he, the man who had raised a whole world over so many graves, would reach out and take it. 21 years of war had been the forge, and in the autumn of 1721, the metal was finally struck. When the treaty was signed at Nystad, it did more than end the longest struggle of Peter's reign. It set down in law a new order in the north. Sweden, the power that had once dictated terms to half of Europe and shattered the Russian army in a single afternoon at Narva, was bled white and could hold the Baltic no longer, and now surrendered the whole coast of its empire. Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, and a stretch of Karelia with the fortress of Viborg passed to Russia and remained Russian. In exchange, Peter returned the greater part of Finland, keeping the one thing he had fought the entire war to win. The Baltic shore the ice-free water, the open door to the west. The Swedish age as a great power was over, and the Russian age had begun. The marsh islands, where a scatter of huts had stood 2 decades before, were now the seat of an empire that reached from that grey northern water to the edge of Asia. And the humiliation of Narva had been answered in full. Medals were struck and cannon fired across the new capital. The war that had opened in catastrophe closed in a triumph without qualification. A transformation so complete demanded a title to match it, and the Senate, the governing body Peter had himself created to run the machinery of his state, assembled to bestow one. They offered him 3 names together: Emperor the Great and Father of the Fatherland. It was more than flattery. It was a formal severing from the Muscovite past. Russia would no longer be a tsardom in the old style, ruled by a sacred and half-hidden sovereign bowed to like an icon. It would be an empire, and its ruler, an emperor, ranked with the Caesars of the West. Amid the cannon and the celebration of that autumn, the man who had once passed his nights as a common labourer in the yards of Zaandam and Amsterdam was proclaimed the first emperor of all Russia. A servant carpenter raised by the sheer force of a single will to a throne styled the equal of any in Europe. The spare Tsar who had been sent to a village to be forgotten now held a title no Russian ruler had ever borne. Of the 3 names the Senate laid on him, it was perhaps the last that carried the most meaning: Father of the Fatherland, for it cast the whole of Russia as a single household, and set him at the head of it, a parent over children who had not always been asked whether they wished to be raised. Even at the summit, the giant could not rest. The reordering of the state had become a ceaseless labour, and he pressed it forward without pause. The old tangle of Muscovite offices had been swept aside and replaced by the ordered colleges and the ruling Senate, a government built on paper to run whether the Tsar was present or 1,000 miles away on campaign. And in 1722 he set the capstone upon it, the table of ranks, which laid the whole service of the empire into 14 ascending grades, and made a man's advancement depend not on the birth he came from, but on the service he rendered. A commoner who served well might now climb above a prince who did not, and every ambition in Russia was bound to the throne it had to rise toward. It was the same ladder that had lifted a captured washerwoman and a street seller's boy to the heights now written into the law of the land. To pay for the permanent army and the standing fleet the new empire required, he ordered a sweeping census and laid a poll tax upon every male soul it counted, numbering his subjects one by one to fund the machine that governed them. It was a system of iron efficiency, and it bore down hardest on those least able to carry it, binding the peasant to the tax and the tax to the army in a single unbroken chain. Still the reach was not spent. In 1722 he turned south once more, leading a campaign to the shores of the Caspian in pursuit of the trade of the East, driving an aging body across another frontier because he could imagine no other way to live. The internal maladies that had shadowed him for years were tightening their grip, and yet he could not hold still long enough to let them heal. He submitted to the cures his physicians pressed upon him, and then rose from them to ride to the next inspection, the next launching, the next campaign. To Peter, stillness was a kind of death, and he would not be still while he could stand. The engineer went on driving his machine even as the machine of his own body began to break down beneath him. Yet beneath the glitter of the new empire, the structure was hollow at its centre. Peter had raised a monument to order and left his own house in ruin. The grown son he had destroyed in the fortress had left a wound that no ceremony could close, and the death of his little son Peter Petrovitch in 1719 had put out his last hope of a direct male heir in the ordinary line of descent. In answer, He reached, as he always did, for the instrument of the decree. In 1722 he swept away the ancient custom by which the eldest son inherited, and proclaimed that the reigning sovereign might name whichever successor he judged worthy of the crown. He meant it to ensure that only a capable hand would ever hold the empire. In the end it accomplished the reverse, leaving the throne to the will of the moment and the strength of whoever stood nearest to it when the time came. The law that was meant to guarantee a worthy heir would, within a generation, throw the crown open to conspiracy and the barracks. In 1724 he raised Catherine to sit beside him, crowning the former captive of Marienburg as empress, an elevation without precedent for a woman who had begun her life washing other people's linen. She alone could quiet the rages and the convulsions that still seized him. She alone could lay a hand upon the giant without fear. But not even that bond stood clear of the poisoned air of his court. Late in 1724, her chamberlain Villemont was arrested and put to death for corruption, and the capital filled with whispers that the charge concealed a deeper wound, that in it Peter had found a betrayal touching the empress herself. Tradition would go further still and tell that the Tsar had his wife brought to look upon the severed head of her favourite, a last cold cruelty passing between them. Whether any of it happened as the story claims cannot be verified. It is a legend that clings to his final months, and it should be named as legend and no more, though the very readiness of men to believe such a thing of him measures the fear he cast even over those who stood closest to his person. What is certain is only that Mons went to his death, and that the marriage of the emperor and the washerwoman he had crowned passed its last months under a shadow, while the court that had risen with him began, even now, to divide over what would come after him. The glory of the empire was real, and it was built to last. The price of it had been paid in blood and in the breaking of his own line. He had made a state that could outlive him, and had failed at the single task that might have kept it from tearing itself apart once he was gone. A man of colossal will, who had mastered war and administration and the sea, he came, toward the end of his life, having provided his empire with everything but the one thing it would need most, a settled hand to take it up. He had numbered every soul in Russia, and could not name the one who would follow him. He had begun as a spare Tsar in a meadow, and ended as the first emperor of all the Russias, master of the Baltic, lord of a country he had dragged bodily out of its own past. There was only one thing the giant had failed to arrange, and it was the single thing that mattered most: who would sit on the throne when his own hands could no longer hold it. He had killed the son who should have followed him, and buried the little one who might have. And as the winter of 1724 closed in, the old sickness in his body that no mineral spring had ever cured began, at last, to close in too. The most powerful man in the world was about to die without an heir. By the winter of 1724, the giant was failing. For years the vast energy that had driven the reign had been guttering against a long-standing disease of the bladder and the urinary tract, an internal affliction that had left him in recurring, burning pain through much of his later life. Legend would afterward give his death a nobler cause, and tell that the end came upon him after he plunged into the icy waters of the Gulf of Finland near Lahta to haul drowning soldiers from a foundering boat, taking a mortal chill in the act of saving them. It is a story that suits the man, casting the tireless Tsar as the rescuer of his own people to the very last, and it is only that, a legend laid over a body that a slow and mortal illness had already carried near its end. The sickness was no sudden accident of cold water. It was the long culmination of a life spent grinding itself to pieces without rest. and it should be named as legend and then set aside. As January of 1725 gave way to February, the palace in St. Petersburg fell quiet under the weight of what was coming. The Tsar, who had never learned to be still, who had spent his days at the lathe and the forge and the drafting table, who could not sit through a ceremony without his hands moving, was confined now to a bed, his face working with the old convulsive spasms that had marked him since boyhood. The accounts of his last days describe a man struggling not against any enemy but against his own body, and losing. As the fever deepened, his speech began to fail. There is a persistent tale, dear to those who love a clean ending, that in a last hour of clarity he called for pen and paper to name his successor, and could only scratch the words "give all to" before his strength gave out, and the pen slipped from his hand. Like so much that clings to his name, it is an anecdote of doubtful origin, a piece of theatre offered to satisfy the wish for a final testament from a life that had refused all tidy shape. It, too, should be named as legend, and no more. The colder truth is that he died on the morning of the 8th of February, 1725, at about 52 years of age, and left no clear word for the throne he had remade with such force. The vacuum his death opened was filled at once by the 2 engines of power he had built with his own hands. The Guards regiments, the elite units grown from the play soldiers of his boyhood at Preobrazhenskoe, the loyal soldiers the Red Staircase had first taught him that a ruler must always command, were the masters of the capital, and they knew their own interest. Beside them stood Prince Menshikov, the low-born favourite who by tradition had begun as a boy hawking pies in the street, and who had risen to be the second man in the empire. These 2 forces, the Guards and the upstart prince, did not wait for the morning to end. They moved to defend the new world Peter had made, and in a single swift stroke they set his widow upon the throne. Catherine, who had entered Russian history as a captured servant washing other people's linen, became Catherine I, Empress Regnant of all the Russias. It was the last and clearest proof of Peter's revolution. He had so thoroughly broken the old order of birth and blood that a man of no family could raise a woman of no station to the summit of the state, and the state would obey. Yet the same stroke opened a long instability. By dying with no settled heir, and by having set aside the old law of succession in favour of the sword and the Guards, Peter left the throne a prize for the strongest. For decades after him the crown would pass by palace coup and regimental intervention, seized and unseated by the very Guards he had raised, until the century was nearly spent. The corps whose muskets and axes had turned his own childhood into a nightmare, remade into the instrument of his will, now stood as the arbiter of who might rule Russia at all, the wound of the Red Staircase closing at the last into the shape of an empire's guard. To look back over the whole of that life is to see 2 figures that will not merge, and that must nonetheless be held together in a single view. There is the Peter of the legend, the reforming autocrat, the shipwright who laboured with his own hands in the yards of Amsterdam and Deptford, the ruler who grasped that Russia must take up the science and the statecraft of the West, or be left forever behind by it. This Peter built the Senate and the colleges, bound the Church to the state through the Holy Synod, and laid down the table of ranks that opened service to merit. He turned a landlocked, inward-looking country toward the sea, built a navy where there had been only river craft, and raised a capital of stone out of the northern fog. That transformation was real and deep and lasting. It won Russia a seat among the great powers of the earth, a place it would hold, through triumph and disaster alike, for 200 years. Beneath that achievement lies the other truth, the one the legend has labored for generations to bury. It is the truth of the knout. The modernization was never an invitation, it was a conquest, and Peter treated his own people as a defeated province. He did not merely alter the customs of Russia, the beards, the coats, the calendar, the very shape of the letters. He outlawed the old world and made the act of living as one's grandfathers had lived into a form of treason. When the church stood in the way of his authority, he abolished its independence and turned the ancient hierarchy of the faith into a department of his government. And when his own son came to embody everything he meant to destroy, the old Moscow, the old devotion, the old refusal, he brought the boy home under a promise he did not keep, had him questioned under torture, and let him be broken until he died in a fortress cell. The city on the Neva stands as the truest monument to that double nature. St. Petersburg is by any measure a work of astonishing will, a city of palaces and canals conjured out of a drowned marsh, where by every rule of sense no capital should ever stand. It is also a city raised over its own dead. Tens of thousands of conscripted labourers, peasants torn from their villages, soldiers, prisoners of war, were driven into those marshes to haul earth and drive piles, and they perished there of exposure and hunger and disease in numbers no ledger ever fully recorded. The figures the sources offer run from some 30,000 into estimates far higher, and the true count is lost. The city built on bones is a phrase, not a reckoning, but it points at something real. The place mirrored its maker exactly, a gleaming, rational European vision brought into being through the calculated expenditure of those who had no voice to refuse it. At the root of all of it lay a staircase and a boy. The massacre on the Red Staircase in 1682 had left the 9-year-old with one searing lesson, that a ruler is only as safe as the armed men who answer to him, and he applied it for the rest of his life with a terrible, unbroken consistency. He answered the Streltsy who had drenched his childhood in blood by breaking their core forever and leaving its men in the squares of Moscow through a winter. He came to look on the world less as a people to be led than as raw material to be beaten into the shape of his design. He was the giant who could not be still, whose face convulsed with the pressure of a mind that never rested, and who, when his subjects faltered before the pace of his decrees, reached again and again for the harshest tool within his grasp. The wonder of what he made and the cruelty of how he made it were never two separate things. They were one thing, and he was one man. They buried the giant in the cathedral of the fortress on the Neva, the same fortress where his son had died, in the city he had raised on more graves than anyone would ever count. Above him the spire he had planned went on climbing toward the pale northern light, and around him the empire he had willed into being carried on without him, and would carry on for 200 years. The legend says he was the carpenter who built a modern Russia with his own 2 hands, and the legend is true. It simply leaves out the cost. The core hanged in the squares, the multitude beneath the marshes, the church broken to the state, the old world shattered, the sun destroyed in a stone room a mile from where they laid the father. He was the reformer, and he was the terror, and he was never the one without the other. He did not civilize a nation gently, he did it with the knout, and the nation he made never forgot either the glory or the price.